Our first reading this morning comes from the book of Esther, the second chapter, verses 5 through 9. Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish the Benjaminite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The girl was fair and beautiful, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in the custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and advanced her and her maids into the best place in the harem. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. Last week, as we considered a hero from the book of Ruth, we spent a little time talking about how most of the characters in that story that we get to know in any kind of detail are folks who have this pronounced sense of honor and duty. And the main challenges against the protagonists in that story, Naomi and Ruth, were not people, but circumstances. So some of you may remember from your English classes in high school and college the different literary themes that carry through different works of literature, like man versus man, man versus machine, man versus nature. Man versus nature really, I think, would be probably what you'd be talking about in terms of Ruth and Naomi, because they were in many ways victims of circumstance. And the way they responded to it with their profound sense of duty and honor defined their character. They were dealing with issues like a famine, the loss of their husbands and sons, poverty, and things like that. They were situational. Now, this morning, as we consider Esther and the situation in the book that carries her name, the main characters are Jews living in exile in the Persian Empire. And while people like Esther and Mordecai do have a sense of honor and duty in this story, they seem to be, in many ways, islands in a sea of immorality, debauchery, and political power plays. I mean, if you were to look at this story and take it, it would be really easy to kind of modernize it for a tale of political intrigue in this day and age in many ways, I think, because of these are the kinds of things that if you're going to watch a drama or a political thriller on television or in the movies, it has a lot of these particular characteristics in it. So it makes an interesting read, but in many ways, it is incredibly different from the book of Ruth. So speaking of the Persian Empire, it was the height of the Persian Empire's influence and power in the world, about 400 and 500 years before Jesus appears on the scene. And the empire of the Persians stretched from Ethiopia, and not just Ethiopia, but a huge swath of northern Africa, all the way over to India, to the Indus Valley. So portions of what's now known as India were part of the empire. And then in its northward reaches, it reached up into southern Europe to places like Italy and Greece, and a little farther east up into what we now call the Russian Federation. I still want to say the Soviet Union because that's what I grew up with. But those areas now that are kind of the southern republics of the Russian Federation were under portions of what is now that territory was under the control of the Persians. This was a huge empire. The land that was controlled by the Persians was amazing. And yet, in the middle of that, according to what is considered some of the most reliable scholarship, at the time that these events take place, the king, Ahasuerus, who was on the throne in Persia at the time, had just suffered a humiliating defeat. His forces had just suffered a humiliating defeat in the northwest by an outnumbered alliance of Greeks. And the Greeks weren't like the Greeks that we think about in the days leading up to Jesus, the Greek Empire. They were really at that point just kind of a loose confederation of tribes at that time. And yet they were able to unite, and with an inferior number of forces, humiliatingly defeat the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. And according, again, to some of the scholarship that has studied that time, it was then in which King Ahasuerus sought comfort in his harem, and as it says in one historian's account, in much wine. And it seems to line up with the events of the story of Esther. And as we read in the book of Esther, we find that King Ahasuerus is merry with wine. I think he was probably drowning his sorrows after that defeat, and then also seeking comfort in his harem, and that's, his many, many wives. And at that time, while he's at this party and he's celebrating in spite of this defeat, he orders his eunuchs, his servants, to bring his queen, Vashti, to his presence so that he could show her off to the people. And what a beautiful queen he has, because the word tells us she was beautiful. But Vashti refused. Now, I can't imagine why. I mean, why join a party? Why not join a party in which her husband is already 3 sheets to the wind and partying with other women in his harem and a bunch of other folks? I mean, this is one of those places in the Bible where you kind of have to point out that just because it happens in the Bible doesn't mean that God is telling you this is okay, all right? All right. You have to kind of look at the Bible through the eyes of understanding that some of the things that happen there, I mean, the Bible really in many places takes an unflinching look at us human beings and how we behave. And God usually makes it pretty clear when people are behaving in ways in which they should not. And in fact, in many ways, you even see the word says that even with cases like Solomon, the wise, that even though he took on lots of wives, that God made it pretty clear this was not a good idea. So back to Queen Vashti. She refuses to come into the king's presence, and so Ahasuerus makes a decision. But first he consults his advisors, because this was a time in a kingdom in which it was unacceptable to refuse the king and his edicts, even if you were married to him. And so this cost Vashti greatly. Ahasuerus, as I said, consults his advisors, who are afraid that if she is allowed to get away with this, then all the other women in the kingdom are going to follow suit and rebel against their husbands. And so they advise him, you cannot let this stand. And so what ends up happening then is she loses her position, and the king makes a decree that she is never again to come into his presence. He effectively divorces her, and though it doesn't say much more about Queen Vashti, and she loses that title queen, one can only imagine she must have been either imprisoned or executed for this behavior. And so following that, the king embarks on what I can only describe as a 5th century BC version of a reality show, a national contest to find the fairest young maiden in the land, to borrow some language from fairy tales. And that's where the first reading picks up. So it's like if this is The Bachelor, it's King Bachelor, right? So he's going to figure out which one he wants, and he's going to give her a rose, right? And then she's going to become his number one wife, I guess you would say, not his only wife. And so that's where the first reading picked up this morning when we hear about this young woman, Hadassah, that's her Hebrew name, but then she has also a Persian name, Esther. That's where we begin to hear about her, as during this contest. She is the one who captures the eye of the folks who are going out there into the land to find the one who would become the new queen. But she keeps the fact that she is Jewish a secret on the advice of her cousin Mordecai. And being an orphan, she had been raised by him. And so Mordecai, he seems to love her like a daughter. And he himself is prominent enough in leadership in the capital city of Susa, where the king rules from, that he is able to kind of keep tabs on how things are going with Esther. And he can communicate with her, although very often it seems to be by messenger. Incidentally, around the same time, Mordecai discovers a plot by a couple of Ahasuerus' eunuchs, some of those servants, that he discovers this plot. They've gotten upset with the king, and they've decided to assassinate him. Mordecai discovers this, sends word to the king through Esther, and by doing so, by stopping this plot, Mordecai and Esther then, of course, earn great favor with the king. Well, again, around the same time, there's another person gaining prominence in the king's eyes. We don't hear exactly why, but he's a guy by the name of Haman. One, perhaps, reason that he is gaining fame and notoriety is because of his great wealth. And we'll talk in a moment about how that comes into play in the story. But when you hear the name Haman, in fact, if we were religiously observant Jews celebrating Purim and we said the name Haman, people would stomp their feet and make unpleasant noises, because Haman's the kind of guy that if we were going to write a story and put it on film or on television, we would probably start the minor key music once he kind of pops onto the screen, right? I mean, this is the guy, he's the bad guy of the story. I mean, there's some other bad guys in the story, but Haman is the number one bad guy. And he gains a place of prominence in the kingdom and well. In fact, his place is second only to the king. He is seated above all the other officials who, as it says, gather in the city gates. Now, in the ancient Near East at the time, and anytime you read this in the Bible, that people were sitting in the city gates and discussing something, it wasn't just a few guys hanging out on the porch, whittling something and complaining about the world or whatever. This was an official place where decisions were made that affected the governance of that city or of that state. So when Haman would come into the city gate, because of his place of prominence, by order of the king, people would bow to him and do obeisance to him. Everyone, that is, except for Mordecai. Mordecai would not bow because religiously observant Jews did not bow to anyone but their God. Now, interestingly, in the entire book of Esther, the word God, the name of God, is never mentioned. And yet, it is preserved in the canon of Holy Scripture as being God's word. And the reason for that is because, as you'll see as we get a little farther into this story, it is very clear, even though God is never mentioned, that God is at work, that God is working on behalf of his people. So Jews don't bow to anyone but their God. That's implied but not stated. I mean, it just says Jews don't bow to anybody. And so because he's a Jew, he won't do this. And this really upsets Haman. And so he devises a plan to get rid of Mordecai, along with all of the rest of the Jewish population. It almost seems to me, as I read this story, that the entire nation of the Jews who are living under Persian oppression are incidental to the story as far as Haman is concerned. The Jewish people in Persia had been there for a few generations, and I think the reason they don't have to bow is because what as often happens, and as I say a few generations, we hear that Mordecai's great-grandfather was brought into captivity. And as is the case in many of the other nations into which the Jews had been led captive, after they've been there for a while, they begin to earn a place of favor. We see this happen in Egypt. But then we also see it happen later, after the Persian Empire. We see it happen with the Greeks and with the Romans, where they don't have to observe the same kind of civil religious practices that the rest of the nation has to do. Like, say, for example, the Romans. And I mention this one because I know a little bit more about it, but it was considered kind of like paying your taxes to go to whatever local temple of a Roman god happened to be in your community and kind of get your card stamped there in order to participate in life in the community, at least in terms of governmental things. It was kind of like paying your taxes. If you're going to be a part of the empire, you got to worship one of the Roman gods. But the Jews didn't have to do this. They were allowed to worship Yahweh, who they believed, and we believe, is the one true God. So Jews didn't bow to anyone but their own God. So Haman, rather than saying it's the Jews, he just says to Ahasuerus, there's this group of people living in the land, and they rebel against the king's edict. They don't do what you've told them to do, and they don't bow to anyone that you've told them to bow to. So I tell you what, king, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, would it be okay for me to take your authority? And you know what? I tell you, I'll pay for it. I'm going to put money in the treasury. So he bribes the king. Would it be okay for me to eliminate these opponents of yours? I'm going to take them out. I'm going to send out orders if you let me do it. And so the king gives him his signet ring, which is, it's like the king giving him his signature that he can sign documents with. And he says, go, do whatever you need to by my authority. Without even realizing that he was granting him the authority to take out Mordecai, who had saved his life, and Esther, his brand new queen. So Haman sends out word to all of the provinces to execute this order on a particular day at a particular hour, and this is published. And so Mordecai learns of this, and he goes into a period of public mourning. He tears his garments, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he won't even go up to the city gate, but he wails loudly outside the city gate because it was against the law for him to mourn in the city gate. So, of course, word gets back to Esther that Mordecai is behaving this way. And when she finds out what's causing it, that's where we pick up on today's second reading for this morning, our core reading for this morning. So I'm going to read you from Esther once again, chapter 4, verses 4 through 14. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her of how Mordecai was behaving, the queen was deeply distressed. So she sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of a written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther to explain it to her and charge her to go to the king to make a supplication to him and entreat him for her people. Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply back to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. Now, in that world, once a king had made a decree, he couldn't go back on it. Even if that edict, even if that decree was made by someone like Haman, who had tricked the king into essentially signing a false order or just granting a blank check type of authority for someone else to sign for him. I mean, we, with our sensibilities, would understand the king is a human being and can make mistakes. But in that day and age, kings were hoping that people would believe that they were not just mortal human beings, but when in fact were a sort of god or demigod. And again, I mentioned Egypt earlier, and that's one of the clearest examples where the pharaohs were considered to be among the panoply of the gods, that they were to be worshipped and given obeisance to in much the same way that one would do for someone they were worshiping as God. And while it may not have been as pronounced in the Persian culture, it was certainly something that people would consider, or the kings would consider, that they wanted their people to believe that they were, in fact, if not a god in themselves, they were an agent of the divine, and thereby would be infallible. And we've already seen what happens when the king's authority is called into question, where people begin to believe that the king is just another human being. Some of the eunuchs, the servants of the king, had even tried to devise a plot to assassinate the king. For the king to admit that he'd made a mistake would likely prove fatal. I mean, the king had to prove his own press that he had that divine authority. And in addition to that assassination plot, we've seen where the king's advisors reminded him that what happened in the palace becomes an example for all the subjects. For instance, what Vashti had done. I mean, you and I, if I tell Jana to do something and she says no, I say, yes, dear. That's fine. But in that day and age, that was considered completely unacceptable, particularly for someone in authority, because that became an example for everybody else in the kingdom. And though it might seem ridiculous for us to think that, all the women in the land are going to refuse to obey their husbands just because of this one instance, that was actually a real consideration. So when Esther is challenged by Mordecai with the notion that she is supposed to go to the king unbidden, unasked for, while he's holding court and showing off what a powerful, wonderful guy he is publicly, then she is truly putting her life at risk. We already know that being a physically attractive woman, as the word tells us that Esther was, we know that, even if you're the queen, grants no immunity because we've seen what's happened to Vashti. We also know that the rules of kings have to be obeyed and cannot be undone. So Mordecai's instructions to Esther to go before the king and speak without first being spoken to carries real danger if the king doesn't then point his scepter towards her and allow her to speak. Fortunately, I believe Esther, one of her superpowers was winsomeness. Winsomeness. And let me just kind of explain what winsomeness is. I mean, I put winsomeness up there, and you see there's a little computer in the background. And I put that there because we don't always behave winsomely when we're online, do we? We should, but a lot of times what people spew out over the internet is kind of unpleasant and not winsome. I mean, think about it. When somebody posts something online or reads an article, and then you go down to the comment section, which I don't recommend, it just makes you angry. You go and you read the comments. Do you think anybody changes their minds based on those vitriolic postings? Probably not very many. When somebody's being anonymously nasty on the internet, all they do is firm people up in their positions. And so that's why I put that behind there on winsomeness. Winsomeness is the opposite of that. That's where you can win some over to your position. You can win some over by nature of your personality or your attractiveness. In fact, I wanted to put down there that Esther's superpower was her attractiveness. I mean, she was, to borrow, again, language from fairy tales, she was the fairest in the land. She had been officially recognized as such in the search for a new queen. And maybe one of her other superpowers becomes her willingness to do what was right, even if she had to be reminded of it by Mordecai. But I didn't want attractiveness to get confused with strictly physical beauty, because that's not what attractiveness is all about, is it? Sometimes attractiveness has to do with personality, how we talk to one another, how people feel when they're in our presence. And sometimes it's hard for us to put our finger on that, but we know people who make us feel like we're important when we're around them. I think that's part of what Esther was able to do. And I think her ability, her super ability, it was to be able to deploy that attractiveness, both physically and through her personality, in such a way that people wanted to be around her. And that she did have the ability to influence someone to stop a great evil and accomplish a great good if she would just do what God was calling her to do. You ever known people like that? Someone who's not only good-looking and fun to be around, but also doesn't misuse that attractiveness, that winsomeness. You know, someone who's not a manipulator, because, you know, we've all known people who have used those sorts of attributes to manipulate people, right? That's a different deal. That you walk away from those encounters going, gosh, I think I've been manipulated. But you know those people we like to be around that kind of bring the best out of us? They make us better than what we were. Since I've already called out Jan, I'll say I'm married to one like that. I hope you know what it's like to be around people like that, and I hope sometimes you can be that person to others. You know, the opposite of that, I think, would be like being what a recent popular movie called Mean Girls was. Or, you know, I grew up with kind of the classic notion in the 1980s of there was the jocks, the football stars who would misuse their attractiveness or their ability to kind of bully other people and make them do what they want. But then we also know those folks who stand up at the right moment, that have that kind of ability to do something like that, but use their powers for good rather than evil at just the right moment to affect some good in the world. Now, if Esther had a kryptonite, I would say that it was fatalism. Now, let me define that one as well with Esther's kryptonite being fatalism, and you'll see the Venn diagram that I have behind this point. I left that little scripture out there. Actually, let me go back to that scripture if I could. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Proverbs, Solomon does a much better job of saying that than I do. So anyway, but go on to that next point. And there's some words you kind of get a little nervous. It's not they're bad words, but you don't necessarily want to say them from the pulpit. But you know, there's this saying that we have, if you do or if you don't, you're still in that same situation. That's a kind of fatalism, okay? You follow me? It's like, it doesn't matter what I do, this is how things are going to turn out. And it doesn't necessarily mean, in a negative sense, like what I put up on the slide there, that it doesn't matter, I'm just going to die, kind of fatal in that sense. But in terms of fate, that there is a fate that you can't escape. Now, I'm a Methodist who went to a Presbyterian seminary. And so I lived with this great tension that exists between folks, say, of a Calvinistic background, like the Presbyterians, or a Wesleyan background, like me and you all, where we tend to affirm more often than not human free agency, okay? In other words, that I get to choose whether I line up with God's will or not, whereas someone who is, and this is way on the other end of the Calvinistic spectrum, a hyper-Calvinistic double predestinarian would say that it doesn't matter it doesn't matter, there is no such thing as real human choice because that would compromise the sovereignty of God, that God makes all the decisions and it's been made since before your birth and there's nothing you can do about it. Here's an example to illustrate that with humor. A Methodist and a Presbyterian are walking through this building and both of them fall down the same set of stairs. I hope there are no Presbyterians in here. So the Methodist gets to the bottom of the stairs, and being justice-minded as he is, he says, you know what, I'm going to write a letter about this, and they need to fix this staircase and install a handrail and maybe put in some ramps, and there's justice that needs to be done here, right? We need to stand up and do something about this situation, and if not, we're going to bring a lawsuit. And the Presbyterian gets to the bottom of that same set of stairs and goes, whew, glad that's over with. I didn't bring you a joke. You've got one now. And I'm sorry. That is kind of painting with a rather broad brush. And please don't go tell the Presbyterian pastor. I'll have some explaining to do. But anyway, the point is that there is this idea of fatalism that some of us carry around, thinking that we're destined for something, and there's nothing we can do to get out of it. Esther seems to have something of that same inclination. Now, let's understand she lived in a different culture than we do, but Mordecai was trusting that God would preserve his people, and he says that. He doesn't say God, but he says help will arise from another quarter. He's affirming the activity of God without saying God's name. But he trusted that his people, that the Jews, would not be wiped out, no matter how badly some people in power wanted to make that happen. And it seems the test of history bears this out, does it not? Because how many times have people tried to wipe out the Jews from history? God doesn't allow it to happen. God had promised that they would not be wiped out. And to this point in her life, Esther had just sort of gone where she'd been told to go. In many ways, she was exactly what they wanted in that culture out of a woman, was someone who was a compliant, obedient individual and would do what they're told to do, speak when they're spoken to. And she just followed the path of those that had power over her laid out. She was a woman in a world where women had no official power. She was a Jew in a land where Jews were a captive people, and she kept that a secret. Now she was being called by Mordecai, and I believe by God, to reveal that. She was someone who didn't have a history of making trouble for herself where there wasn't any. And perhaps she was tempted to just sort of hope that things would turn out okay. In fact, Mordecai seems to indicate this in his messages to her, if she just kept her head down and did what she was told. But Mordecai points out she can no longer do this, that now is the time to stand up. It was not the time to fatally accept whatever happened, to say that it was just her destiny, but instead that she potentially had the power, due to her position, her attractiveness, her winsomeness, to stop this great evil from happening. And so finally, Esther, at the urging of Mordecai, puts on her game face and stops following wherever life is going to lead her and just goes all in. She lets it ride. She goes in to do what God has called her to do with the words, "And if I perish, I perish." Her fatalism, her acceptance of whatever happens to her, with just a little bit of adjustment, turns to grim determination. In other words, from accepting whatever happens to her because of outside circumstances, she decides, I'm going to do what's right and accept whatever the consequences, but now it's dependent upon my actions. Do you see how very small but significant that adjustment is? I mean, I've often said that a lie is the skin of the truth, or that evil is the skin of the truth stuffed with a lie. And I borrowed that from a Christian apologist. But another way to think about it is, when we are led astray to do evil, we don't end up very much off course. Very much our intent on evil, it comes out of a desire to do the right thing, but we kind of make our own adjustment to it, and we get just a little bit off course. And so to get back on course doesn't require that much of an adjustment either. I mean, we say repentance is literally, it's what it means, is turning around and going away from. But sometimes all it takes is a course correction, a very slight course correction, to get back on the track of where God is calling us to go. So here's your main point for this morning. Even an overplayed strength, which you may remember from a few weeks ago I said is a weakness, can be pulled back into something godly, like grim determination, like Esther's grim determination. Whatever the circumstances, I'm going to do the right thing. And if I perish, I perish, she says. When we accept the idea that God has given us a purpose, a function, and a role in His kingdom, a purpose, a function, and a role that matters, we can make a significant difference with just one action when we truly have the ability to say, like our vision says, our mission says, and you'll see that at the top of the bulletin, making disciples of Jesus Christ for what? For the transformation of the world. That's our mission as United Methodists, and that's our mission as members of this congregation. So if you want to transform the world, sometimes all it takes is one decision and a recognition that you have a place and a calling in God's kingdom. So the question is, will you accept the calling that God has placed on your life to change the world? Here's your question for consideration this morning. This is what I want you to pray about and think about as you go home from this place. For what are you willing to lay it all on the line? Laying it on the line, or like I said earlier, let it ride. Now, I'm going to make a confession. I had some cousins who taught me how to play poker when I was pretty young. This is not me endorsing gambling, don't get me wrong, or even poker for that matter. But I learned about playing poker, and just so that you'll know, my cousins, and I was only like 6 or 7 maybe at the time, we were playing with little bits of yarn, little strips of yarn. And so, so not even chips, okay? So we're playing with these little strips of yarn. And I remember at one point, one of the cousins, the older cousins that was teaching me, he takes everything, his whole stack of yarn, and he pushes it into the middle of the table, and he says, I'm going to let it ride. And I thought, he pushed it. He didn't ride anything. What does that mean? And I asked him, what does that mean, let it ride? And he said, I'll explain to you in a moment. Shh. And we continued to play out the hand, and of course, he won. And he explained to me afterwards, he said, when I know that there's almost no chance of me losing, I make a big bet like that so that I make it clear that I'm confident in what's in my hand. Of course, I also learned later you can lie about what's in your hand that way, but that's not what he was doing. He won the hand because he was confident that he was going to take everything from the pot that day. So letting it ride, putting everything on the line, going all in implies a confidence in your hand. You're almost certain you're going to win. Esther was anything but certain that she held the winning hand, at least when it came to her personal life. I think at best she had a 50-50 shot, at best. But when it comes to doing the right thing, friends, we're not gamblers, we're Jesus followers. When it comes to doing the right thing, sometimes we let it ride knowing that your own hand may not win, or at least not win for you because you're going to win for the kingdom of God. You may know that you're going to possibly expect some very personal loss because you know that God holds the winning hand. So in what situation in your life is God calling you to let it ride? To lay it all on the line? Is it to speak up against an injustice that no one else seems to care about? Or maybe it's to just share with someone about the difference that Jesus has made in your life and the hope that he offers for their life, even if it means that people are going to label you as a Bible thumper and a Jesus freak. Or maybe it's to refuse to engage in some evil that everyone else is doing or that everyone else has accepted. And your job is to refuse to accept it. Or maybe it's to take that step of faith that God is calling you to make, knowing that you do not have the resources to do it on your own, that you're going to have to count on God to make up the difference. Or maybe it's to stop simply keeping your head down and instead lift up your head and engage the situations around you with the confidence that God is the one who's brought you to the place you are for just such a time as this. I mean, think about Jesus for a moment. When Jesus seemed to be at his very most weakest, with the least apparent power, when all of his disciples had run away and he was there, being led to the cross, not even speaking a word on his own half, he was actually deploying the most powerful weapon, using the most powerful tool in the toolbox he had for the redemption of the world, which was laying down his life for you and me. Because, my brothers and sisters, he also had the power not only to lay his life down, but he also demonstrated he had the power to take that life up again and grant that same life to you and me. And by his simple acceptance of the place, the purpose, and the role that God the Father had given him in the kingdom, the Son transformed the world forever. You know, Jesus had all kinds of supernatural power at his disposal. I believe the Gospels make that incredibly clear. And yet in that moment, he divested himself of all that power. It doesn't take supernatural power to be a superhero in God's kingdom. It just takes one decision to do the right thing or to not do the wrong thing. It's no mistake that God has placed you in the situation where you find yourself in life at this moment. I'll even say it's no mistake that God has placed you in this very room at this very moment. God has a word to speak to you today for your purpose and for your divine appointment. God has given you a divine appointment. Will you meet the challenge?